So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nada Ibrahim, who is Senior Research Officer with our CIFA team and whose expertise is in intimate partner violence in the Australian Muslim community. Nada will be busting myths around domestic violence and Muslim societies. Welcome, Nada.
Thank you, Lauren, for that. Good morning, everyone, and peace be with you. I just wanted to say a little bit, I just wanted to share a little bit about my background. My first degree is in psychology, so I'm a psychologist/criminologist. So my PhD is actually in criminology, and specifically I have looked at partner violence within the Muslim community. Even though it is a specialization in that area, I do have background in terms of just looking at partner violence or domestic violence as a whole. I have been working with the Muslim community for a very, very long time. I actually grew up working with the community for the past, I'd say, a good 15 years. And it does take a long process to actually establish those contacts, and I work a lot with the community leaders in order to allow access to those little pockets of migrant communities that exist within the Muslim community. So today I'll be talking to you about myth busting, basically domestic family violence and Muslim societies. And so perhaps what the idea is that some of the perceptions that you might have about the Muslim community, we can be we can be changing those perceptions, increasing in your knowledge in the area. There'll be some things that you may not be familiar with, so it's about allowing that familiarity, and so you could utilize a lot of the information that we're sharing today in your practices as well as any research that you might be doing.
Would you like to do a poll?
Okay, looks like we're going to be doing, we can do a poll before we continue. Yeah.
Oh, we've just got a quick one.
Yes, that's correct, because we wanted to do a few of those.
So we'll close that and share.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to talk to that a bit.
Okay, so we have the results show that majority, which is 62%, believe that Muslim women are oppressed. About 48% believe that Muslim women are brought up to be inferior. 38% believe that Muslim women believe that violence is part of their religion. Muslim women, about 33% believe that Muslim women are more likely to be domestic violence victims. So that's, throughout my presentation today, we will be going through some of these issues. Yeah?
Sorry, they've selected them as myths. They've said that they're myths, not that they believe them as truth.
Okay, my mistake. So the myths that are, the ones that the two most popular ones are that Muslim women are brought up to be inferior and Muslim women are oppressed. So obviously, if I'm taking back to the first poll that was done, that about 0 to 20 women that come into your practice, I suppose then you would have had an opportunity to see that these are actually myths that are floating around, and that you as practitioners, I suppose, would have that opportunity to be able to debunk some of those myths as well. Today we'll be adding to a bit more of your knowledge to be able to arm you with more knowledge that can actually bust those myths that are actually floating within the mainstream population.
Okay, I'll close that for you now.
Okay, thank you. All right. So let's begin. The first thing that I wanted to actually talk about is that I'm just going to make that a bit smaller. So what we're going to be covering in the presentation today is we're going to talk a little bit about what is Sharia. A lot of people don't know what the word Sharia is. They hear it, but they don't know what it is, and some people get scared of the word. So by the end of this session, hopefully it will be a word that you'll be using quite comfortably. The other issue that we're going to cover is what is the marriage etiquette within Islam. We are going to talk about domestic and family violence and what are some of the legal considerations that we need to take that we have to take on board. We're also going to talk about how perpetrators misinterpret Islamic texts to justify abuse, and I'm going to share with you a case study that was from the 16th century during the Ottoman Empire, just to show you that that domestic violence was something that was addressed within the earlier period of Islam, and it's not something that is new as in comparison to if you look at within the within the Western kind of context where it only became something that was really looked at seriously from the 1920s onward with the feminist movement. Okay, so let's just keep moving. So what I wanted to say to you is that one thing that I wanted to basically talk about is that when we are looking at intimate partner violence, it's actually not confined to any particular age, social status, cultural background, religious background, socioeconomic status, or country, or age group, or what have you. So it is something that actually crosses all those boundaries. So that's something to keep in mind, and I'm sure that you know that already, so I'm just reiterating this point again. I wanted to just share this scenario with you, and I'm going to read it out, and this is from the Eastdale study that was done in the US, where one of the participants says this. She says, "I was never in 10 years of my life able to walk outside of my door without my husband accompanying me. I was one man's prisoner. Before my husband goes to work, he used to put a little stone behind the security door, and because of his job, he'd come anytime he wants. When he came back home, if that little stone has fallen down, I never was allowed to have even $1, just in case I would get a bus and run away. I had no money, no access to the phone, no access to the door." So this is an example of some of the scenarios that I've actually come across within the Muslim community itself, and particularly this is quite pertinent when you're looking at migrant communities. So if someone has just migrated into Australia, so it doesn't matter, even though this scenario so basically it's like a scenario that can be talking to any kind of background. So it doesn't just have to be somebody from a mainstream population. So and I've actually seen this happen where what a husband used to do was he used to put a little stick near between the screen door and the actual lock of the door. So if that stick would fall off, he would know that his wife has actually gotten out of the house, and so he used to use that as some of the mechanisms to control his wife. So basically it isn't, as you can see, it isn't something that's restricted to just one particular culture or socioeconomic background or what have you. What I wanted to actually talk about as well is that if you're looking at it from, because I'm going to get into the Sharia perspective, but basically what we see out there is that Islam is commonly portrayed as condoning wife abuse, and this is in particular it comes in because of the misunderstanding that people have about the text. And so hopefully by the end of the session you'd have had a bit more information, I suppose, about those texts and how you can be utilizing that when you have actually a Muslim perpetrator that comes to you saying that the text allows him to beat his wife, for example. So what would your response be in those kind of situations? And quite often, as I said, the text that is used, and there's actually particularly one verse, chapter 4, which is called the women, and verse 34 is what is used. If it is read out of context, quite often that's what is used by a lot of perpetrators to actually perpetrate violence. And often a lot of women as well, they actually, because they don't understand what this verse means, they believe that that their text allows the man to actually behave in a certain way towards them. And when I'm discussing this verse, I'm going to go indeed a little bit of depth into that. There's actually 3 words within the text that I'm going to retain in its Arabic form that actually becomes an issue that is misunderstood by a lot of, just general the lay person in the community. What I'm going to also provide for you is some evidence from the legal text as to what are some of the leading scholars' views, contemporary as well as classical scholars in Islam, about this issue of violence, or this verse 434. And just a point about this chapter called the Women, which is chapter 4 of the Quran. It actually has guidelines. It has got principles. It has got restrictions, etc., about how a relationship should be. And I need to touch on this verse a little bit. This chapter a little bit further as I go along. But I just wanted to remind you that the issue when we're talking about domestic violence, and I know that you're familiar with this, and I'm just reiterating some of the points here. Domestic violence is actually an umbrella word that usually refers to any form of violence or any form of abusive behaviors in a domestic setting. So it could include things like elder abuse, sibling abuse, child abuse, partner abuse, etc., etc. So it's an umbrella word. So intimate partner violence is specifically looking at partner violence within a husband and wife or two people who are cohabiting. So basically, when I'm talking about domestic violence within today's presentation, I'm actually focusing it between a husband and wife, because in the Islamic framework, any relationship outside of marriage is actually not recognized. So for that purpose, it is actually being, I'm actually focusing just between the husband and wife. And it's actually one of the most common categories of domestic violence is actually male partner violence against the wife or against women. So when I'm looking at intimate partner violence within the Muslim community in the Western, in the Western context, you see that that intimate partner violence is not specific to Muslim communities. It's actually a human problem. So any human problem will exist within the Muslim community. So when you're actually dealing as a practitioner with someone from a Muslim community, you generally tend to strip the fact that the person's faith. Obviously, in terms of interacting with them, you need to consider the faith. But when you're looking at how do I deal with this person, you need to look at it from the fact that this is a human problem. How am I going to deal with another human being on this issue? So based on that, that's the approach to usually take when you're actually dealing with issues related to intimate partner violence or any form of violence within a Muslim marriage. Unfortunately, there's limited research within this area, so a lot of my research for the PhD as well as a postdoc is actually specifically looking at Muslim communities. So now we go into the area of Sharia, and when we're looking at the high objectives of Sharia, so Sharia basically means divine law. It actually linguistically means the path towards a watering hole. So basically when you look at pre-Islamic Arabia, people used to converge to an area depending on where there was a water source, because obviously, as you are aware, that where there's a water source, people will actually come and settle in those areas a bit more. And this is where that word comes in linguistically about it being the way to a watering hole. And so Sharia, when you look at it from the perspective of, from actually not a literal point of view, but from the context point of view, it's actually how it's a code of conduct. It's a code of guidelines. It's a code of how do we live as human beings in the private sphere as well as in the public sphere. So it is actually divine laws that are extracted from the Quran, which is the holy scripture for Muslims, and the Hadith, which is the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So when we look, and so there are two major sources where Islamic law originates from. And so based on this are the high objectives of Sharia, which will come in the next slide. But I just wanted to show you what are the distinctions between the two. So when you look at Sharia, which is translated as Islamic jurisprudence, if you want to use that word, and then there's another area called fiqh. Fiqh is basically where there is a group of scholars who are trained in specific sciences of traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, sciences of Quran. They're trained in law. They're trained in how to extract law from, or the foundations of law. So based on that, they actually come up with certain precedents that are actually applicable to particular social context. So if you want to just have a distinction between the two, when you look at Sharia, it's actually divine revelation. When you look at fiqh, which is, as I said, it's Islamic law, or the Islamic or the laws that are specific to a particular context, is actually a process of human reasoning. So it's a process through which a group of scholars come together. Like say, for example, we've got the Fiqh Council of Europe. So what they do is they look at issues related to that particular social context in the European setting. Then you have the differences again is that when you look at Sharia, it's a general directive. So there are general guidelines on what to do about a certain issue. When you look at fiqh, it's detailed solutions about a particular or unprecedented issue. So for example, if you're looking at Australia, you look at the issue of buying a house. So quite often you find that people will be looking at, can I, as a Muslim, I can't take any loans that have an interest. So in this situation, if I'm living in Australia where it's hard to get rental properties, I'm constantly having to move, etc., what are the rulings on those areas? So this is where fiqh comes into play. Then when you look at the issue of Islamic jurisprudence or Sharia, it's actually contained in a divine revelation. So these are things that are prescribed by, because of the fact that God has created us, there are certain prescriptions on how best to live our lives. Fiqh, on the other hand, is a rational endeavor. So it's a speculative reasoning. When you look at Sharia, that has a close affinity towards the doctrine of Islam. And when you look at fiqh, it doesn't have the same authority. So if I go on to the next slide, I wanted to show you something here that, that if you wanted to look at Islamic rulings of fiqh, it's actually like a tree. So you have the roots at the bottom, which is the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, or the other word used for it is Sunnah, the Arabic word. So that's the roots that remain constant. So long as the roots are in place, the tree is sound. So that's how, if you want to visualize this. When you look at the trunk itself, these are the 5 pillars of Islam. So as you know, there are 5 pillars, so I'm not going to go into that, but that's the trunk of the Islamic rulings. Then you have the branches. The branches are the different schools of thought. So we have predominantly, we've got within the Sunni school of thought, you've got 4 predominant schools of thought. They are more. Then you've got obviously, you've got also the Shia school of thought. Then when you look at the fatwas or the legal rulings themselves, they are like leaves. So when you have winter, for example, as winter is approaching, during autumn the leaves fall off. And so in spring you have some new leaves that come in because of the change in weather. So similarly, when you look at the social context in Australia, there would be certain fatwas or legal rulings that would be relevant to that particular time or social context. As the situation changes, it may not be applicable anymore. So that would fall off and another fatwa will take its place, or another legal ruling will take its place. So now just looking at, then bring that information about what I've spoken to into this slide over here. So basically the Sharia is general principles. So they are actually known as universals. So within that there are essentials as well as goals. And so within this, and this is a process that the scholars actually use a process called istislah, or a process where they actually look at what is the common good for people. And so based on that they come up with certain universals. So there are about 5 that are common. So any scholar will actually be familiar with this, and they've identified 5, and there's a few more that have been added to it. So basically they say that any ruling or any Sharia ruling, any legal ruling, any precedence or in the code of conduct within the Quran has a purpose of 5 different purposes. So one is the preservation of religion and morality, the other is preservation of life and health, preservation of progeny, preservation of intellect, and preservation of wealth. So any rulings that the scholars who are fiqh scholars, they will actually look at these elements and look at how does that contribute towards the preservation of these 5 areas. So particularly when you're looking at domestic violence or partner violence, we look at preservation of life and health. So anything that contradicts that becomes detrimental to the person's health. So then we look, and based on that is where the legal rulings for domestic violence comes in terms of like the practices. So these are actually again based on, just to reiterate, it's based on the Quranic text as well as the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how Islam talks about the relationships, and this is the next topic that we mentioned we were going to be talking about. So basically the Quran has got certain guidelines about how the treatment of wives should happen in a relationship, and we've got certain guidelines about the in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad and how treatment of wives should occur. So basically when we look at marriage in Islam, it's a contract. So it's a contract between a man, a woman, and God. So it's actually the basis of society. So it's not something, and that's the only other place when God mentions in the Quran about contracts between God and the prophets. The only other place where he uses, there's a specific word that he uses. He uses the word mithaq ghalidh, which means a very strong covenant. The only other place in the Quran where this word is mentioned is a contract between a man, wife, and God. And so because of that contract that exists, there has to be certain guidelines that are provided on how the relationship should be. So if you see like in the brackets that I have, these are verses from the Quran. So for example, chapter 2, verse 2 to 8, would refer to equal responsibility or equal rights, one over the other. So basically the principle is that one person's right is the other person's responsibility, and vice versa. So this doesn't in any way mean that one has superiority over the other, or one has in front of the law, obviously. So generally within the Quran, there are verses that actually talk about that the marriage has to be based on care, mercy, kindness, mutual consultation, justice, etc., etc., etc. So I'm going to give you an example of a mutual consultation. If something as simple as that can be mentioned in the Quran, imagine the other things you need to consult on. So one of the things that the Quran states, where God says that when you come to wean off a child, so you're breastfeeding, right? You want to wean off the child from breastfeeding, you have to mutually consult about the period of time, because the right of a child is 2 years to be breastfed. So that's the legal ruling, that any child has got, he or she has the right to be breastfed for 2 years. If you decide you want to wean them off a bit earlier, then you have to have a mutual consultation together as husband and wife. So you can imagine, if the intricacy that something as detailed as breastfeeding can be covered, imagine the rest of the things that would be covered about the relationship between a husband and wife. The other verses that talk about, there are a number of other verses that are listed in there that actually talk about issues related to how the relationship should be between a husband and wife. One of the most beautiful things that I find in the Quran that talks about the relationship between husband and wife is like their garments to each other. So basically, you protect each other. You are there to cover each other's flaws. You are there to provide comfort for them. So what does a garment do for you when you wear that? That's exactly what the relationship has to be. And there are 3 ingredients that I always reiterate as being they have to be in a relationship. And this is something that you'll find that is consistently, when there's a marriage sermon, that they actually, the marriage celebrant will talk about these qualities that should exist in a relationship. So one is sakan, which means tranquility. So each partner is looking for tranquility in the other. Muwadda basically means unconditional love. And it goes beyond marriage love. It actually talks about you have it's a deep connection, and it actually comes from one of the attributes of God, al-Wadud. Then the Rahmah means mercy. So basically there has to exist mercy. So and the reason that mercy is important in there is because if there is something that you don't like about a person, about your wife or your husband, at least when you have mercy, you treat them with respect for their dignity. So basically that's within the Quran. So if I look at the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad and how it describes the treatment of wives, it says that, and we actually see that in the example of the Prophet Muhammad, how he was with his wives, because he was obviously in a relationship where he had multiple wives. So it always says that it has to be based on kindness, love, compassion, mercy, and justice. And these are actually documented in the books of Hadith and books of tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. So, for example, I'll give you one example where once one of the companions of the Prophet asked him, he said, what do I owe my wife as a responsibility? So he said to her, give her food when you take food, clothe her when you clothe yourself, do not revile her face, and do not beat her. So this is one of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. So, and he also said that the best among you is the best to their wives, and he actually said that I'm the best to my wife. So from the traditions we can actually see that this is how the prescription of how a person should actually be treating his wife in a relationship. Can I go back to you, Lauren, so you can do the next poll?
Yep, sure. I'm just try that one. Okay. We've also had feedback from a participant that diagram was really helpful, Nada.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's excellent. I'm glad I included it. Laura, can I ask you, so is just that one other question, or there's another one?
No, that's the final.
That's it, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. So 83% have voted. Close that very soon. Okay, I'll close that one and share it.
Okay. So we have 100% say her safety. So when a woman, definitely, that's, when you look even at the high objectives of Sharia, you find that that's the most important thing. Her health and her safety is the most important thing for you to consider. So good on you for actually, voting that way. Okay. So let's now get back to, now I'm going to talk to you about I think I have about 10 minutes. Is that correct, Lauren? Okay, I'm going to assume that it's 10 minutes, so that we can start with the questions. So if just a reminder, so any questions that you may have, please feel free to type it in the question panel, and Lauren will be actually taking those questions throughout the session. So basically, when we're looking at the Islamic law on intimate partner violence, it's actually deduced, as I said before, from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as the fatwas. And go back to thinking about that the tree that we had before. So those leaves are the legal opinions or the fatwas that are considered. And often, in order to be able to understand the legal rulings, you need to actually put things into context onto how is this issue actually looked at from the Quranic as well as the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad perspective. So when we look at the legal text, classical as well as contemporary scholars, what their views are, they all say that partner violence is an oppression. So, and here I quote to you the European Council for Fatwa and Research. And so they say that any kind of oppression is a prohibition in Islam because there's injustice. And so because of that injustice, and one of the things that I find that's quite beautiful in terms of, there's this collection called Hadith Qudsi, which is basically, it's another type of traditions that where the words come directly from God. And so where God prohibits oppression on others, and so in that he prohibits oppression on himself, and so he prohibits oppression on others. And because of the issue of justice being paramount in terms of a relationship, when there is partner violence, that automatically becomes oppression. It automatically becomes injustice in the relationship. And based on that, and based on the verses on the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, it actually becomes prohibited in the Quran. As well as in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as in the faith. So any form of abuse against wives would be considered, or a wife would be considered to be injustice, and hence it's prohibited in Islam. So that's a legal verdict in Islam. So if we have, here we have got this, that the legal ruling is that it is prohibited, then we ask, and particularly because the behavior is prohibited because of, it goes against preservation of health, preservation of intellect, preservation of wealth, preservation of the person's religion. Like I know that when I had done some interviews with some of the victims, Muslim victims of violence, one of the things that they used to say is that their religion was being, jeopardized at that stage, particularly when they're going through that form of violence. And so here, when you have that high objectives of Sharia is preservation of life, then these contradict that divine approach, which is based on rightness and kindness, so automatically that would be considered as being prohibited. This statement over here is actually the Council of International Fiqh Academy, what they've actually come up about partner violence. And usually the issue of intimate partner violence is addressed in Islamic law under a concept called darar, which means harm. So these include any form of abuse against the wife. And so basically, when we look at, there may be some instances where financial abuse is taking place. So in this instance, under Islamic law, it is actually the financial responsibility of the husband to provide for his wife. So when he doesn't do that, then he's actually contradicting what his responsibility is. And I'm going to come to that verse very shortly. But basically, when he's unable to fulfill the responsibility towards his wife or even her sexual needs, he's absent from the house for a very long time. He mistreats her family, or there are other issues that might happen. So this would be a situation where she can actually ask for dissolution of that marriage contract. I'm going to go on forward. So here, like, if we're saying that all these things are in place, so what do we understand about the verse 434? So I'm going to quickly look at 3 issues related to the verse. So when it is actually misunderstood, the verse, this is an Arabic transliteration. So obviously what I would like to say here is that an Arabic English transliteration does not capture the essence of the Arabic verse itself. But there are 3 words that are always problematic in terms of how it is understood. قَوَمُونَ نُشُوزُهُنَّ and وَضْرِبُهُنَّ. I'll actually talk about it shortly. But basically, when you're looking at the conventional English translations of the verse, quite often it's translated, and here I would like to stress that it's translated into English to mean these different ways it is translated. So they use the word strike, beat, scourge. So these are problematic. And can I just highlight that in the Arabic meaning of the verse, you will never find these words cropping up. It's always in the English transliteration. So there's always a problem in the way that it's translated in English. So these are the three words, as I said, that we would look at. So quickly looking at the word qawwamuna, basically means responsibility. So here the man is being, the husband, I should use the word husband, has been entrusted with the responsibility of protecting the woman, the care of the woman, defending her honor, fulfilling her needs regarding her religion and her worldly affairs. He does not in any way mean that he should behave to her in an obstinate manner, doesn't mean that he should force her into anything, subjugate her to his will, suppress her individuality, or negate her identity. So in no way does that mean that, because in Islam a woman has her own identity as an individual, and that's, you can actually see that through inheritance laws and so on, which is not really the focus of today's presentation. Maybe we can talk about it in another presentation. However, so if you look at the issue of now, the second term that in that verse, verse 434, is actually misunderstood is the word nushuz. Basically the word nushuz, if you were to translate it into English, the closest you can get is ill conduct, like a severe type of level of behavior that may threaten the continuation of the marriage. So that's basically we're talking about. We're not talking about minor annoyances. So we're not talking about, okay, a person comes home, dinner wasn't served or something happened. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something very, very severe. So it's a legal context that we're talking about here. And the reason that why this word is very important is because this is the one condition where a woman revokes her right to maintenance. So the financial responsibility is on the husband for her to actually provide for her. So in the case where she has engaged in a very severe behavior that will threaten the continuation of the marriage, that's the time when she revokes her right to that maintenance or that financial maintenance that the husband has a responsibility over her. So so when we look at this issue, that's why in Islamic law this is so important. So and the third word that is misunderstood is the word wadribuhunna. And I'm going to maintain that in its Arabic form again because of the, as I said before when I showed you that slide where they use the word beat, scrouge, hit, etc. to actually translate it into English, which is problematic in itself. So when we're looking at the word wadribuhunna and its legal application, we look at the fact that in this verse it's actually there are actually a number of scholars who have said a number of things about this verse. They actually argue that it doesn't in any way imply physical beating. So if I was to go back and look at the word wadribuhunna, the word daraba, a root word from that word wadribuhunna, it's actually in the Quran used in different contexts. So sometimes it is used to travel to travel the world. In other contexts it is used as to earn a living. In other contexts it is used to hit the ground, for example. So there are a number of ways this verb is actually used. So in this context, the way that it's actually used, like if I take in the opinion of one of the schools of thought, which is Imam Shafi'i, he's actually one of the leading scholars in classical Muslim scholars. When he was asked about the question that is a man allowed to exercise this issue, this verb or this issue of symbolic hitting, he said that it is even though it's permitted, that it is actually you shouldn't even be engaging in it. It is better to use the other techniques, and I'm going to go into that very, very quickly. One of the things that when we're looking at this verse, it's verse 434, as I said, we're talking about when the woman is guilty of such behaviors or nushuz, which is such behaviors that actually may threaten the continuation of the marriage. There's actually another verse in the Quran that talks about when the man engages in that, but this is not the actual purpose of today's presentation. So I'm going to focus on where the woman is guilty of that, and because this is a verse that is misinterpreted by a lot of perpetrators. So the word, when the Prophet was asked about this word, about what does this word darab, wadribuhunna mean, he said that it is, unfortunately I don't actually have a miswak to show you, but it's basically when you look at a pen, the miswak is about that size. So once the Prophet, he was using the miswak to brush his teeth, and they asked him that what would you use in order to be able to exercise wadribuhunna. He said not with something not bigger than that. And so basically it's just a symbolic thing that you're trying to grab the attention of the wife. But before proceeding that, there are other prescriptions within the verse. So before you can even think about engaging in that, you have to first advise the wife. So if you, and there's actually a time, there's no time limit about how long does that take. So when you advise someone, you do it in a good manner. So you advise the wife about her behavior. If she doesn't listen and doesn't change that, then the other option that is given there is about engaging in, not engaging in sexual intercourse in the bed. So basically it's about telling the wife that the behavior you're doing is not acceptable, like from a religious perspective. But within that whole period of time, it is supposed to be that he continues to treat her with kindness, respect, justice, etc., etc., etc. And so what I wanted to just then say, I just want to go back to this, that this Wadribuhunna is a very symbolic act. And so it should never be on the face, because any kind of abuse on the face, there is a monetary compensation that is expected as part of that. And so in summation, what I wanted to say here is that classical and contemporary Muslim scholars, they argue that Wadribuhunna actually, it actually should say that it should not mean beating of the wife, despite the fact that how the English translation renders that meaning. And so scholars, they attempt to stipulate strict conditions to govern the process of Wadribuhunna. So it is something that if somebody comes to you like a perpetrator saying, this is why I'm doing it, you need to take that into consideration about how the verse is actually, how the practice of the verb Wadribuhunna is supposed to be within the legal context. And obviously, because you're going to be provided with these with the recording, you'll be able to go a bit more detail into that. So in no way does Islamic law allow domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and there's no circumstances under which a husband can inflict any type of discipline on the wife, regardless of social, psychological, cultural influences that are imposed on the husband. When we're talking about Wadribuhunna, this verse 434, it's specific to the issue of nushuz, where the woman would forfeit her right to financial responsibility that the husband has on her, and that's the only reason that will actually be used. And so it's got a very strict condition. So it's not talking about partner violence in any way. Nushuz is a completely separate legal context. So I wanted to just show you this example of an Ottoman court, what had happened, and I will end with this. Consistent with this understanding, the Ottoman fatwas, they dealt with the issue of partner violence under darar, as I said to you, under harm. In the slides before. So this is evident in the 17th century fatwa, where once one of the Ottomani scholar, Abu al-Saud, he reads that a question was raised to him, Zayd, he hurts his wife Hind in many ways. If the judge knows about it, is he able to separate Hind from Zayd? So separate the two. So the answer that he provided, and he's obviously a judge here, he's able to prevent his hurting her by whatever means possible. Okay, so the court can do anything possible in order to stop that abuse from happening. And so this is a proof that is, that is very important when you're looking at issues related to partner violence. Therefore, when you're looking at physical assault in a relationship, it violates the marriage contract and is actually grounds for immediate divorce in a Muslim, marriage. Okay, so I'm going to just, and there's actually, this is another example where there was actually an issue of that the court had heard about this issue of, a man hitting his wife, and he was actually ordered to actually compensate the wife because of, and under Islamic law, I'm just going to finish with that, under Islamic law, there are certain there's actually a chart that describes that if he breaks a bone, and this is just under criminal law, because under Islam, these issues, partner violence actually exercised under criminal law. And so if a person, say, breaks a bone or they do a bruise or whatever, all these issues there's monetary compensation that comes as part of it. So I'm going to end with that to open for questions.
Yep. So we've got.
I had a bit about implications, but I can talk to that.
Okay. So we have had a question that's come up, and I might just read that one out. Do wives have any similar remedies to sanction a husband's misbehaviour?
Yeah, if you recall, I said that within the Quran there is a verse, chapter 4, same chapter, the women, verse 128 talks specifically about when the man is guilty of nushuz. So he has engaged in behavior that would jeopardize the continuation of the marriage. In that, there are certain prescriptions that are actually put in there. I'm going to pull back. Can you still see that screen?
Yes.
I'm going to pull back that verse 434, because I want you to look at Oh, there's a bit that actually has been removed from there, so it doesn't actually cover the prescription of when a woman. I'm just going to go back to the last slide. So basically, in this instance, what happens is that a woman, she has certain recourse, because given the different nature, the psyche of each one, the prescription that is described by the Quran or by God about how you should go about remedying that, that misbehavior in each one's part, it's actually a different prescription. There's a verse 435 that follows from this verse 434 that we've been talking about, that talks about when there's a situation where both the man and women have been guilty of behavior that will actually threaten the continuation of that marriage. Within that context, it talks about now they have forfeited their right to discipline each other. So when we're talking about discipline, we're not talking about physical, we're talking about discipline as in like you're trying to correct someone's behavior. So in that instance, the court will intervene, and then they will bring in someone from the husband's side or someone from the wife's side, and they'll then look at, is this relationship salvageable? So if it is, they will put certain things into place. So certain acts have to be put into place that there's a follow-up on that. If it isn't, then the court may decide that divorce is the best option for them, and that they, continuing to live together, they'll actually harm each other rather than actually help each other.
That's interesting. I didn't know that divorce existed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's actually a more merciful way. You see, within, just a point there about divorce, within the Islamic framework work, Islamic law, it's more merciful, more just for you to actually exercise divorce rather than continue to oppress that female in that relationship. So, or the kids that are involved. So, because within Islamic framework, the person is allowed 3 divorces. So there is a waiting period, and we can talk about that if you like. But there's actually a waiting period where, if they decide they want to come back again, they can come back without having to renew a marriage contract. So there is that option that's available within Islamic law. So it's a bit more flexible in terms of allowing for, if there was something to happen, you have an option to get out, reassess yourself, and come back into the relationship if you so wish that you want to get back into that relationship.
And women have the same opportunity to instigate that process as men do, or does it have to be
They do, but it's a little bit different with women. With women, and that's why when you have the pre-marriage contract, it is important to put these conditions in the marriage contract. Like you may have in the marriage contract saying that if the husband engages, like for example, if you look at Malaysia, their Sharia code, what they do is that they have 3 points that are in their marriage contract, standard marriage contract. So one is that if the husband engages in any form of domestic violence, she has the right to ask for a divorce. Second point is if he is away for more than, I think it's 2 years, if I'm not, if he doesn't spend on her for more than a specific amount of time, then she has the right to ask for a divorce. If he is away from her, like he's, say, something happened and he's away for a long time, gone away somewhere, then she has the right to ask for a divorce after a particular specific amount of time. I forget how much the time is, but there is a specific amount of time that she can ask for that.
Okay. I have another question here. Are the Muslim men and women, including children, taught this, or is it word of mouth that can often get misconstrued?
So that's the unfortunate thing. Misconstrued, yeah. The unfortunate thing is that when I'll give you an example of, there was a situation where a man was watching one of those TV shows where they have scholars that come up. Because within the Arabic channels, you'll find a lot of, like how you have within the Australian context, every Sunday you'd have religious TV shows, so there'd be sessions. So similarly, you have people would call in, and ask a question, and the faqih or the person who has got the authority to give rulings or legal rulings, they will ask them specific questions. So there was a man who called in, and what had happened was, like, he had come across a husband that came with his wife, obviously, and what they saw over her body was there's a lot of bite marks. And so in the verse that I was saying, verse 434, that bit that is missing from the slide, it has an option. It says that the first step, that if you find a woman is engaging in such behavior that is going to really break that relationship or the marriage or really jeopardize it, that you have to advise them, as I said before. So that word, fa'iduhunna, in Arabic, the word fa'iduhunna means to advise in a goodly manner. when you actually look at it from a slang perspective, if someone is like, say, it can actually be also read as fa'duhunna, which means to bite someone. And they found that all over her body, and they're like, what are you doing? They said this to the husband, and he said, well, that's how I read it in the Quran. So then they had to correct his misconception about how he was reading the text and said, that's not what it means. You need to read it to actually go back to the the interpretations of the Quran about what something means. So here you can find quite often that a lot of men may misread this, a lot of women may misread it. So educating them is very, very important. And one of the things that we're engaging in from a grassroots level with the Muslim community is to actually go through that process of creating some awareness campaigns where they then are educated about what exactly does this verse mean, what exactly does the Quranic text talk about marriage and responsibilities and rights and so on and so forth.
So what is the most respectful way in working with the woman around that if she identifies that she's interpreted the text like you were just saying? What's the most appropriate way to approach that subject with her? Is it best to point it out yourself, or maybe look at ways you can link her with a group, women's group, or a study, Bible, sorry, not Bible study, but
Text. See, there are a few ways you can go about it. One is if you're familiar with the text, and if you look at the PowerPoint slide right now, the top PowerPoint, the first reference there, that's an article that Muhammad Abdullah and myself, we co-authored, and it's actually looking at a critical examination of this verse. So have a look at it. Please go. It is available online. Go through it, read it, because you familiarize yourself with those concepts, because the terminology that is there, there's some Arabic terminology that you need to get your head around. So once you're familiar with that and are comfortable talking to the women about it, go ahead and do it. If you're not comfortable with it, refer them to the imams in different mosques, because there are, if you actually go and Google, you find a list of different mosques in Queensland or in the other states as well. Feel free to go and actually talk to one or link with some of the imams in those mosques. The other option is to refer to us, for example. There are other options where you can actually get them to talk to someone they trust, and often it could be just someone from their own family background who would be able to actually help them. So if you're familiar with someone who can do that, go ahead and do that. But these are like, hopefully that in the future we will have a bit more workshops where people can have a bit more of an idea about these issues. There are also like a number of those references that are listed there where people can actually go and have a look at those and have a bit of a more deeper understanding. That reference right at the bottom, it actually talks about quite in depth about this issue and how it is misunderstood as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got a couple more questions. Are women involved or influential in changing a fatwa? Did I say that right?
The fatwas? Yeah. See, these are where if a woman comes in with a case and says, this is my case, and presents her case and says, these are the issues that I have faced and so on, those things are what are taken into consideration because you look in a social context. Regrettably, we did used to have early Muslim scholars during the time of during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the companions of the Prophet, and the generations that came after that, like 16 centuries, 14, because the Muslim calendar is a little bit different to the English calendar. You've got, because at the moment I think we are in 1437 as in our Muslim calendar, the Hijrah calendar. You find that there were a lot of Muslim scholars who were judges. So they had the right to make, to come up with Islamic law. There's a book called, I forget the name of the book, but it actually has a list of women scholars that existed during those times who were predominantly, they were in the law field. There were women who came up with that people came to them about certain rulings, etc., etc., etc. Because under Islamic law, there's nothing wrong with a woman being a judge, right? And so she would be exposed to a lot of these cases, and so she would be coming up with certain rulings depending on that. I know that, for example, if you look at Malaysia, their faculty of law, they have a lot of women who study there to become barristers, to become judges, etc. And so they definitely have a say in terms of changing some of those fatwas.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to manage the questions that are coming in. So another question that actually it was in relation to when we were discussing filing for divorce. Does the wife have to prove that DV has happened to file for divorce?
See, in any situation where you look at any court of law, you have to have evidence, obviously. So if you can present those kind of, like if, say for example of divorce, there are situations where, say a person was to say, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. You know, because the marriage contract is where both parties want to be there. If they decide, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, they can choose to say, look, I want this is my case and I want to get out of this relationship. So for example, for a woman, if it's a domestic violence issue, she would definitely have hospital records, or she would have police records, or family can attest to that. So she would have witnesses that can say that this is what has happened, and so that becomes presented in the Sharia court or whatever setting it is where a person is asking for divorce. So these are some of the evidence that is actually used in order to get the divorce. But say in an instance where a woman says, there's something called khula in Islam, where this word is where the woman asks for divorce just for any reason. That she just doesn't want to continue with that relationship. So because it's a contract, right, between the husband and wife, and they need to consent to be in that relationship. I'll give you an example of during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there was a woman who saw her husband with this group of men. So when she saw them coming, she looked at him and she felt that she found him not to be very attractive in that crowd. So she said to the Prophet Muhammad, she said, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. And he asked her why. He said, because I see him as really ugly within that, when I see him with the rest of these men. So she felt a repulsion. And a relationship where, if you remember, I said that one of the ingredients of a marriage is tranquility. If you can't find tranquility anymore in that relationship because of whatever reason, then really you shouldn't continue with that relationship, because divorce is there as an option. And so in this kind of instance, you find that when you look at, obviously, as I said to you, because of it's a court setting, you have to provide certain evidence in order to be able to get out of it. If I look at the Malaysian setting, when I was talking to one of the women who is a leading barrister in the courts, Sharia courts in Malaysia, she had actually said about this issue of domestic violence. So long as you can prove, you've got witnesses, you've got evidence, etc., they should be able to give that woman that divorce, because that relationship is no longer just.
Okay. So I have one last question, which I think will probably take us to time. The participant has said that they understand that this is about partner violence, but what about parent-to-child violence, where we hear about parents fatally disciplining their child due to shame brought on the family? Would you say this was cultural rather than religious?
See, these things are usually, sorry, say that, can you reiterate the question again? Just want to make sure that I've understood it correctly.
From the beginning? Yep. So in relation to parent-to-child violence, where we hear about parents fatally disciplining their child due to shame brought on the family, would you say this is cultural rather than religious?
Yeah, definitely. Because see, if I tell you about what religion says about how the relationship between a child and the parent should be, it has to be based on mercy, kindness. One of the things that I can quote, there's a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad that says that deal with your young with mercy because they're ignorant in life experiences. And when you deal with the elders, deal with them with respect because they have life experiences. So, I'll share with you an example about, just to show you how the Prophet Muhammad showed how the relationship should be with the child and the parent. So there was once, he was giving a sermon on the pulpit. Obviously, it was on a Friday congregational prayer, and while he was doing that, and as you can imagine, this is a congregational prayer. There's thousands of people who are there gathered to listen to the sermon before the prayer starts. As he was talking, one of his grandkids came. The grandkid was wearing, as you know, that the Arabs tend to wear those gowns that are a bit longer for like men. And so as the child was walking, he kept tripping on that garment, and he kept tripping. And so the Prophet Muhammad, he got down from the pulpit, came down, picked up the child, carried him, and went and continued giving the sermon. after he finished the sermon, he said to them, he said to the companions, he said, I saw in your eyes how you felt, the way that you looked at me, as to why are you, you're giving a sermon and now you're coming and picking up a child and so on. So he said, this is because I saw that the child was trying to walk, was walking and he was kept tripping. Out of mercy in my heart, I actually came and I picked him up. And so, and one of the things that you'll find that when we talk about mercy for mothers and fathers, etc., there is this tradition of the Prophet Muhammad that says that when a man came and asked the Prophet, he said to him, who is most, in terms of the parents, who is most deserving of my favor? He said, your mother. Then he asked him, then who? He said, your mother. And then he said, then who? He said, your mother. Then he said, then who? He said, your father. So this is to indicate the relationship, the responsibility, I guess the caring responsibility that the woman undertakes as a mother. And so similarly, when you look at a child is vulnerable, it's in your care, is being put there by God for you to take care of the child. And there are a lot of verses in the Quran that talk about this relationship. Like say, for example, there's one that says that says that about the financial responsibility on the child that the parents have. It says that do not, because during the time of pre-Islamic Arabia, and you find now in India, for example, we find that a lot of people who are killing their infants, their female infants in particular, because of poverty, etc. And God says in the Quran, do not kill your children because of your fear of poverty or because of your fear that you may not be able to provide for them, etc., etc., etc. So these, and within the Quranic context, there's a lot of other verses as well, and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad that talks about that relationship between the parents and the kids. And so one of the things that you will be held accountable for as parents is, we're talking about the Day of Judgment here, that the parents are held accountable for, and within the Islamic law framework as well, is that how do they treat their kids. So there is that, and one of the other things as well within the Quran that says is do not favor the male over the female, because they both of them have equal rights on you. So these are some of the things that you'll find within the Quran. Unfortunately, when it comes to culture, there are certain things that superimposes itself, where the practice of giving, when I was looking at some of the texts in pre-Islamic Arabia, they used to favor the boys over the girls, where they would give them education and not the girls. They would give them the first meat that comes from like when they slaughter a cow, whatever, over the females, because over the females, because they would find that they didn't have enough to go around, so they would actually favor the boys over the girls. So Islam was about stopping that and saying that each one has a right over you as a child.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time now, and that's the last of the questions that have come through. So I'd just like to thank you, Nada. That was really interesting and helpful. And if anyone has any further questions that they would like to ask Nada, you can send through questions to me and I can pass them on to Nada. Also, I'd just like to ask everybody and thank everybody for attending, and just ask everyone to please complete the survey that will come through later on today. But otherwise, that's the end, and thank you for joining. All right.
Thank you so much, everyone.